Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar and the launch of the WPA Zero Carbon White Paper. I'd like to start by introducing myself. I'm Michael Meadows, Head of Planning at British Land. Our speaker, who is Councillor Heather Acton, the Council's lead member on climate action, and our panellists, Dr. Amy Jones, Climate Resilience Director at Westminster, Sonal Jain, Sustainability Director at JLL, and Tor Burrows, Executive Director of Sustainability and Innovation at Grosvenor, and my WPA Senior Advisory Group co-chair. This white paper was commissioned by the WPA in response to the Council's Climate Emergency Declaration and target to make the city net zero by 2040. The WPA has endorsed the declaration and welcomes the priority that the Council is putting onto climate action. During the webinar, we'll explore the white paper in more detail and its recommendations, and I would encourage you to please submit questions for our panel via the chat function. There will be 2 live polling questions during the panel discussion as well, so please do look out for those. And before we turn to the white paper, I'd like to invite Councillor Heather Acton to share with us some of the Council's priorities for climate action.
Thank you very much, Mike. And I'm really delighted to join you here today on behalf of Councillor Rachel Robotham, who is the leader of the Council and in fact is leading the climate action agenda. But I'm here really to welcome the publication of this really important research paper on how the built environment in particular can contribute to our ambition to be net zero carbon across the city by 2040. And Rachel points out in the foreword to her paper, it's really only the start of the work. And we've got many challenges ahead. But this provides us really with an excellent starting point. And we're really delighted to be working together with you. So I'd like to sort of emphasize, the climate emergency, why it's a priority for Westminster. We declared climate emergency outlining our commitment for us as the Council to become carbon neutral by 2030 and for the city to become carbon neutral by 2040. It was 10 years ahead of government targets, but there's been great announcements today. And anyway, I think everybody here knows why carbon neutrality is important for our planet. Westminster has the highest carbon emissions in London and some of the highest by local authority area in the UK. And this reflects the city's historic makeup, the high influx previously of workers and visitors, and its also previous economic importance. I mean, so much has changed since our climate emergency declaration, and the impact of COVID on the economy has perhaps made our task even harder, but it's also really underscored the possibility that we can make a positive difference. It also really emphasizes the importance of building a clean, resilient and efficient city. But there is possibility of change. What are we doing already to try and change? We're looking at ways of cutting carbon from the energy that we supply through the Pimlico heating district and our social housing. And actually those are collectively 70% of our footprint. We're exploring ways to cut the carbon impact of council-owned housing and aiming to get as many to EPC-B rating. And we're looking at renewable energy technologies such as solar panels. We've been trialling food waste collections for 7,500 homes and also reviewing the frequency of residential and commercial waste collections to encourage our miserably low recycling rates. And we're incorporating sustainability measures and new low carbon developments like the Ebury Bridge Regeneration Scheme, rolling out electric charging points. We've already installed 450, but we'll soon be at 1,000 across the city. Enhancing the successful clean air programme that we've had to promote the benefits of improved air quality and reducing carbon emissions, and trying to be really ambitious with our freight deliveries, servicing and waste trips. However, tackling our own emissions will only deal with a fraction of our problems, and it was shocking to me that the council, that's only 2% of Westminster's carbon as for the city as a whole. So you all really have a vital role to play in what we need to do. And we've got to build on this moment where everyone, I think, witnesses the scale of change that is possible, but need to grab the opportunity to deliver lasting change for residents and workers, so that we have a sustainable, thriving low carbon economy. The built environment is the largest source of carbon emissions. It's responsible for around 85% across the city. And we know that many of you landowners and developers are making great strides in tackling emissions, but we do need to go further and faster to achieve zero carbon city by 2040. This white paper really offers a fantastic opportunity to raise the level of ambition, to cut carbon from the built environment, but it also helps us recognise the importance of working collectively and collaboratively. We can all learn from each other in tackling the challenge. And this paper captures a commitment from a wide range of stakeholders to take ambitious and what will undoubtedly be difficult steps to achieve net carbon zero by 2040 or earlier. And the scale of this means that we do need to work together. So the importance for us of working in partnership with the WPA and beyond through implementing the recommendations of the paper means driving local action on the climate emergency, increasing our collective influence with other partners, and also with central government, although, as I say, they've made a reasonable start today. So thanks very much, and I look forward to hearing more. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Heather, and I'm sure my panelists and the audience will join me in congratulating the Council on the progress you've made since making the declaration in 2019, and share your ambition and your desire to work together in partnership across the city to tackle the climate emergency. Now, I know that you have to leave before the end of the webinar, but Dr. Amy Jones is going to represent Westminster on our panel. And in a moment, I'm going to hand over to Sonal Jain, who's going to give us an overview of the white paper and its recommendations. But before I do, I wanted to thank JLL and Sonal and her team for all of her support and technical input onto the white paper. Also the WPA board and my fellow senior advisory group members for their input and critical thinking, the input we've had from Westminster City Council and many, many other contributors who are listed in the white paper. So with that, I will hand over to Sonal.
Thank you, Mike. Great. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of the launch event and share the key messages from the white paper. So I've got 10 minutes and I'm going to cover I'll start off with background to this research and the objectives of the white paper. We'll then look at how Westminster's net zero target translates to a vision for built environment. And then I'll share the key recommendations on how WPA members and the City Council jointly can deliver on this vision. I'll briefly touch upon some of the best practice examples of initiatives led by WPA members already before concluding with next steps. This paper, which will land in your inbox soon, has wealth of information on net zero carbon, what it means for built environment, and detailed recommendations for WPA's diverse membership group, big and small, to take it on board. So these recommendations are also supported by case studies, which help demonstrate practical application of some of the solutions we are recommending. So please do take time to review the findings in detail later, and we would very much like to hear your feedback and thoughts. Next slide, please. So to start off with objectives, some of this Mike mentioned. I mean, firstly, the white paper has been written to support and contribute towards City Council's ambition for a net zero carbon Westminster by 2040. The focus of the paper is on buildings, and the paper in a way provides a radical blueprint for how to reduce the environmental impact of Westminster's built environment. And finally, the paper provides an opportunity to share ideas, solutions, and collaborate with other members of WPA community and the council. Next slide, please. So before doing a deep dive on built environment, it's worth appreciating the broader context, which actually Councillor Heather Acton brilliantly articulated about the 2% and the 98% and everything in the mix. So the 2040 net zero carbon target covers the entire city of Westminster. Hence, the scope of this ambition is much broader. I mean, covering a number of work streams, as we just heard, including energy supply, transport, waste, and consumption across the city, green space, and the built environment. And there are two important things to note here. I mean, firstly, if you look at emissions from the city, built environment is the most significant contributor. Our analysis matches quite closely with the data that the council holds, and what we have found is the city's residential, commercial, and institutional buildings together combined account for over 60% of city's emissions. So there is no doubt that extra attention is needed to drive down the emissions from built environment. This figure is just not acceptable to lead with. Secondly, these work streams are all interconnected. Many of these work streams serve and support the city's built environment, and action by WPA members and council on built environment will no doubt positively influence outcomes in all these other areas that you see in the green bubbles as well. Next slide, please. So now let's look at built environment. To start with, we have articulated Westminster's 2040 net zero carbon ambition into a vision for cities' built environment. Having this common vision that every actor within the built environment buys into is very important, and it really helps us contextualize the outcomes of various sub-work streams within the built environment. Starting with heritage assets, there are 11,000 listed buildings within the city. All of these will need to be sustainably retrofitted and adapted using sensitive solutions that preserve their historic significance. All new developments must be net zero no later than 2030. This means new builds are primarily built with all electric systems, powered by renewable energy, and designed and constructed in a way that reduces embodied carbon of the developments. On existing buildings, frankly, this is where real effort is needed. We have some data which shows 50% of cities' housing stock is over 100 years old. So appropriate retrofit solutions alongside decarbonisation of energy supply needs to be rolled out at scale. Coming to public realm, which is very much part of built environment, will be created with low carbon materials and designed to maximize green space within the city. And any residual emissions from built environment will be offset by investing in credible schemes that maximize local community benefit, so we benefit within the boundaries of the city council itself. And finally, underpinning this vision is the ambition to set high standards for transparency, to report on actual performance of buildings and avoid any risk of greenwashing later on. So all of this vision has to be achieved in the next 20 years. Next slide, please. As you will appreciate, this is a bold vision, and it is clear that incremental change will not be sufficient. This will need radical transformation of the property sector. And given there are so many actors within the built environment, this will also need radical collaboration between all stakeholders. Next slide, please. So next, let's look at how can we deliver on this vision. We know that WPA membership ranges from historic landed estates and FTSE 100 development companies through to small design practices and affordable housing charities. It's a real mix. And establishing a roadmap to 2040 that is accessible and practical for all members certainly poses some challenges. We have categorized the key challenges under 4 headings here. First is planning and technical restraints. Westminster's sensitive and historic assets, combined with a complex planning framework and conflicting priorities, pose both regulatory and technical challenges, something which we are all very acutely aware of. Second is requirement for upfront investment and additional resources. Understandably, retrofitting existing building stock will require upfront investment, and this can be challenging, particularly in current climate. Further, not all members within the WPA community have the same resourcing capacity or a long-term investment approach to commercially justify this upfront outlay. Third is the greater need for knowledge and skills. Net zero is an emerging concept, and we don't have an experienced supply chain ready to deliver. This is also further compounded by the fact that there is still a lack of common understanding of what exactly is a net zero carbon building. And then finally, the 4th challenge is around performance gap in buildings, which is the real disconnect between how buildings are designed and how they actually perform in operation. They're much worse in operation than initially predicted. This gap also exists because of the inability of landlords, both commercial and domestic, to influence tenant behaviors and actually even have visibility of performance at whole building level. Next slide, please. So through this paper, we have identified a set of recommendations for WPA members to deliver on the 2040 net zero carbon vision while accounting for these 4 challenges. So coming on to the first point on overcoming the planning and technical restraints, WPA members will need to work creatively with planning officers to maximize carbon reduction outcomes from planning decisions. We have a great case study on Ebury Street from Grosvenor in the report, which demonstrates how this can be done. Not easy, but it is being done. The members should also subscribe to a robust carbon reduction framework that covers both operational and embodied carbon. This framework must be used as a basis to navigate conflicting priorities and invest in solutions that reduce carbon over the whole life of the building. Coming to the second challenge on upfront investment and resources, frankly, taking a climate-first approach to building design, building construction, and management is the only way to minimize costly interventions later on. Also, when considering interventions, switching to an all-electric system powered by renewable energy offers one of the best solutions to decarbonize emissions at building level. And adopting approaches to minimize embodied carbon when done right often supports the business case quite strongly. British Land's One Triton Square case study is a great example here, where savings in embodied carbon also resulted in lower construction costs. And then on lack of knowledge and skills, the starting point here is agreeing on a common definition of net zero carbon. Ideally one that covers both operational and embodied carbon. For property owners and investors, one of the key recommendations to take on board is to really understand material sources of emissions across their portfolio and use that to establish a decarbonisation pathway to 2040. There are many members within WPA who have already made net zero commitments and have publicly disclosed their decarbonisation pathways. In this report, we've also suggested a pathway template for WPA members. So for businesses who haven't gotten to this stage yet, there is a template for you to use and adapt. And in fact, ideally, we want the entire membership and the council to adopt a common and progressive decarbonisation pathway, be on the same page on what actions need to be implemented. And finally, on minimising the performance gap, this is one area that will need a complete change in the way we deliver our buildings. We need to absolutely adopt an outcome-oriented approach to building design and delivery. And that outcome is actual building energy and carbon performance in use. We have included a case study from Derwent in the report, who are piloting a new scheme called Design for Performance, which responds directly to the performance gap challenge and how they are addressing it. Obviously, robust data monitoring at whole building level is also a priority recommendation here for members to ensure operational energy use is optimized. And when you consider whole building, focus on tenant engagement and strategies to enable positive behavior change is crucial as well. Again, there is a great case study from Crown Estate on effective tenant engagement strategies in the report. Next slide, please. In addition to WPA members, what you see here and in the paper, we have also identified key recommendations for City Council to support delivery of this vision for built environment. As a policymaker, as a planning authority, and as a civic leader, the Council can really help unlock some of these challenges and create a level playing field for all of the members. There are a number of recommendations included in the report for City Council, including, firstly, placing a greater weight on carbon in planning and introducing new climate-first regulations. We all need guidance, particularly on sustainable retrofit of historic buildings. Council can certainly help enable investment in clean infrastructure and use offset funds to support upgrade of resource-constrained assets within the city. And a crucial step for them to lead on is to coordinate a transparent system of public reporting for building performance in use. Next slide, please. So the good news is there are many businesses who are already taking great strides to reduce carbon emissions from their buildings. In this report, you'll find a rich collection of case studies that demonstrate specific solutions to some of the challenges we've just discussed. And these case studies will hopefully give you confidence that none of these challenges are insurmountable. And through close collaboration and sharing of best practice, we can scale these solutions to other buildings in the city. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, yes, it is a bold net zero vision, but it is also achievable if implemented correctly and with close collaboration between WPA members and the Council. I've included a quote here from Council Leader Rachel Robertson, which says, "We will only achieve net zero carbon Westminster by 2040 by working together. The white paper is an important first step, and I look forward to working with WPA to implement the recommendations. Now the real work starts." So in terms of getting started with the real work, we have identified 4 key actions for WPA members and the Council to jointly take forward. First, agree a common definition for net zero carbon buildings based on a whole life carbon approach. Second, establish Westminster's carbon footprint and material sources of emissions. Third, set a robust and progressive carbon reduction pathway. And fourth, create a reporting system for building performance disclosure. The WPA and its diverse membership really stand ready to work in partnership with Council on these next steps. So with that, I'll now hand over to Mike for panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Sonal. And I thought that was a great summary of the white paper. And I really would encourage everyone to read the report when it lands in your inboxes this afternoon. There's a huge amount of detail in the report, including on some of those case studies that Sonal has mentioned from both within Westminster and beyond. And at this point, I would just remind everyone, if there are any questions that you want to submit for the panelists, please do so. And now we're going to go into that panel discussion. I'm going to start with my co-chair, Tor. One of the key themes of our report is collaboration. How vital is knowledge sharing and collaboration between WPA members, Westminster City Council, and their supply chains in securing both a green recovery and a net zero carbon Westminster by 2040?
Thanks so much, Mike. I'm really delighted to be here, and it's great to see the launch of this report. So thanks for the question. For me, the climate crisis is clearly a universal challenge, but I think it also, unites us by providing a shared purpose, to collaborate, share lessons learned, whether you're public sector, private sector, or an individual. No one can achieve this alone. So I think it's important to start with that. Net zero carbon in Westminster by 2040 is a really ambitious target, and I'm sure there'll be bumps along the road, but a green economic recovery from COVID with a climate-focused approach to investment development, will undoubtedly create a better and more resilient city for everyone, for businesses, for visitors and residents. And I think that's a goal really worth fighting for. And I believe we can only achieve this shared vision of a net zero carbon Westminster by working together, sharing lessons learned from innovative technologies or developments, officers working creatively with applicants in the planning application process. It's a really going to be a real joint effort. But I think and hope this white paper is a significant first step on that journey. It's been a pleasure working with Westminster on behalf of the WPA on climate change and sustainability. So, I hope it's the first of many.
Thank you, Tor, and I'd echo that sentiment in this just being the first step, and looking forward to working with Westminster. And on that note, I'm going to turn to Dr. Amy Jones from Westminster. Amy, one of the first issues we identified when we started this piece of work was the lack of a clear industry-wide definition of net zero carbon. How do you think we resolve that, and how important is a whole life carbon approach to minimise both embodied and operational carbon emissions?
Thanks, Michael. Thanks to everyone for inviting me to be part of this today. I'm really pleased that we're at this point where we can acknowledge the great work that you've been doing in recognition of our climate emergency. Net zero carbon, I think it's a bit of a minefield, isn't it, in terms of really bottoming out what all of this means in practice, and it's not lost on us at all. I think if we're really serious about this, we are, from our perspective, we should be aiming for as an ambitious approach as we can make in terms of our interpretation of what that means in practice. And so we very much welcome the guidance set out by the UK Green Building Council, for example, where they look at a definition of both operational or in-use energy and associated emissions, as well as the emissions involved in construction practices for new developments. And I think that by taking that holistic approach, we're going to really get under the skin of this challenge, because I think they also estimate that embodied carbon can be responsible for up to half of the carbon impact of a building over its lifetime. So that's not insignificant, and I think we really need to try and aim high if we're going to get under the skin of this. And I know we have specific expectations set out in various planning or regulatory planning documents, like the City Plan, which mirrors the New London Plan, on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from operational energy and looking to take a whole life cycle approach on referable developments. But for the council, that's the minimum, and we're really hoping to drive a more ambitious approach and be clear on our interpretation of net zero carbon through things like our environmental supplementary planning document that we're looking to bring forward in line with adoption of the city plan next spring, and ahead of that some technical guidance that should help landowners and developers understand the expectations with regards to that definition, and to provide advice on how it's possible to meet that with respect to different building typologies. So hopefully that will be a start in terms of understanding and taking a consistent approach to interpreting that. But we're here to work with you all to try and build that understanding and work collaboratively in terms of understanding what that means in practice on the ground. The last point I would make, though, is that I think in terms of referencing the expectations set out in various planning documents and for new developments, we need to bear in mind that's only a small fraction of the problem. And actually most of the emissions for the built environment come from our existing building stock. So that's about, you know, upgrading, retrofitting, reducing energy demand and supplying low carbon or green energy alternatives. And that's where we really need to focus our efforts.
Amy, thank you very much. And I know WPA members look forward to working with you on the environment SPG and support that building typology approach that you mentioned. Sonal, if I could turn to you, you mentioned in your slides the pathway to net zero that we promote in the white paper. How important do you think it is to set milestones on that pathway, and what are the challenges and opportunities that you see on the way?
Sure. I mean, firstly, I'll start by just reiterating the importance of having a pathway. And I was reflecting on your question, having had the brief earlier on. And there is a famous quote by Thomas Edison, which says, "A vision without execution is hallucination." And I was thinking, you know, this is a great ambition. It needs to be executed. It needs to be executed with a proper plan in place. And this pathway is the starting point, which, you know, 20 years is a long milestone. Leadership will change, council members will change. So having clarity on what we have committed with interim milestones is absolutely a must to ensure we are continuing on this journey. I say that also knowing that the pathway we set today is bound to change. You know, I'm reflecting on one of the requirements which we have strongly put forward, that all new buildings have to be delivered to be with an all electric system in place. And that's a great ambition, great technology that we can use using heat pumps now. We've seen with Derwent's case study, this is practically possible, commercially feasible. And then actually looking at some of the announcements that landed in our inbox last night with hydrogen being prioritized. I mean, who knows, in 10 years time, we'll look at hydrogen in buildings. So this pathway is not set in stone, but it gives us some kind of roadmap to get on with our action. What do we need to do now? What needs to happen in the next 5 years? And we know in the next 5 years, we cannot let any new building being built without a net zero brief. And then what needs to continuously happen throughout is this massive challenge of existing building retrofit. So I think pathway is going to be a core to this execution strategy.
Thank you, Sonal. And we've got the results from the first poll. 70% of you in the audience said that decarbonisation of buildings and responding to climate change was a high business priority. And I think whether you're in that 70% or whether you're in the other 30% of kind of still deciding, then having that pathway and the pathway in the white paper hopefully will be a really useful guide to test your own pathway against, or to help you in creating your own pathways. You mentioned retro fitting, Sonal, and I want to come back to Tor now. You know, we know 78% of Westminster is in conservation area. Westminster has 11,000 listed buildings and structures. What are the challenge in bringing the historic built environment back up to modern energy efficiency standards, and perhaps drawing on some of your own experiences across Grosvenor's portfolio?
Thanks very much, Mike. And I've been trying to keep up with some of the comments in the chat, and I think there's already a good few questions on historic buildings and energy efficiency. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. You know, improving the energy efficiency of our current stock is absolutely fundamental to our net zero goals, but it's also a significant challenge for the industry, not least because of the potential significant investment that you need to upgrade some of the stock. So I'll just touch on Grosvenor's experience with 119 Ebury Street, which is one of the case studies in the paper. So our aim with that property, which is in Belgravia, was to investigate the latest technologies to achieve, I think our goal was about an 80% carbon reduction whilst maintaining the historic fabric of a grade 2 listed Georgian property. And it was used to be a hotel, and it was redeveloped into 3 sustainable apartments. So we secured temporary listed building consent to pilot the retrofit scheme, and we managed to make many improvements to the buildings. So things like secondary vacuum glazing, rainwater harvesting, photovoltaic and solar thermal energy generation. I could go on. And as a result, the building became the first listed building to achieve BREEAM Outstanding. So, I mean, the results was fantastic, but I think it is also worth highlighting some of the challenges, because there were challenges along the way. There are huge amounts of learnings for us in terms of the retrofit process, and there was an increased build costs on that project, and we've of course taken these learnings into our ongoing retrofit program. But coming back to my earlier point on collaboration and the sort of policy and guidance, Grosvenor recently hosted a roundtable with Westminster, Historic England, National Trust and others on how we can work together to simplify some of the guidance and ensure there's consistency with policy and regulation on energy efficiency in historic buildings. So I think we're just starting that journey, and we've had some really good discussions so far. But these practical steps, I think, can really start to help from a practical perspective, but also from a cost perspective. So I hope that's an example of how we're starting to work together to make it easy to implement some of these more challenging areas of our pathways.
Thank you, Tora. I think that's really helpful and a theme that we go into in more detail in the paper.
Yeah.
Sonal, if I could come back to you. Last week, the Chancellor announced that the UK will become the first country in the world to make climate-related financial disclosures mandatory. How important is monitoring and reporting to decarbonising the built environment in Westminster?
Sure. I mean, disclosure, monitoring, reporting, transparency, whatever you want to address it, it is a key lever in enabling the net zero transition of built environment. And I just heard someone else say it is the only way to transfer conversations from boiler room to boardroom. And that puts it, really, you see the numbers, you see the business case stacking up, hopefully, or not, and then that spurs action. And especially talking about the last week's announcement, it's on mandatory climate risk disclosure. It's definitely going to be a game changer for our industry. When property owners and investors will really be able to see the financial value at risk from climate change, it will no doubt spur action on adaptation and on mitigation and decarbonisation of built environment. In the context of Westminster, data collection and public reporting is absolutely key to measuring success against this pathway we keep coming back to, and also understanding how to close the performance gap. In the white paper, we made a series of recommendations for building owners and also the council to help coordinate a transparent system of disclosure. However, I would want to drop this note of caution is we need to standardize any system that we'll end up creating. I mean, I can see companies being inundated with reporting requirements. So we don't want to place unnecessary administrative or resourcing burden to smaller members of Westminster. So whatever reporting system is put in place, hopefully aligns with kind of the national or private sector ambition on disclosure, with ideally similar metrics.
Thank you, Sonal. I'm definitely going to use some of your quotes when I talk about this in the future. They've been great. Thank you. I'm going to turn to some of the questions from the audience now that we've got in the chat. And bear with me, I'm a complete novice at this. I'm used to being on the panel and not in the chair. So this is slightly uncharted territory for me, but here goes. I will try and make my way through. Amy, if I could come to you for the first question. Policy and planning application levels, how do Westminster propose to balance sustainability and heritage drivers?
Thanks. That's a really great question that comes up time again in the conversations that we've been having. I think it's a really tricky one, but something that us as a council we're really keen to try and get under the skin of. We have a really unique challenge in Westminster with the scale of our the number of listed buildings we have and the scale of our conservation status area. I think something like 76% is covered by a conservation status. So if we're going to tackle this problem, then we're going to have to face up to the challenge of balancing the protection of our heritage assets with our sustainability agenda. And I think we're really keen to look at ways in which we can find flexibility within the context of having to meet our statutory requirements with regards to preserving heritage. And we have started those conversations both internally and, as Tor mentioned, externally with stakeholders. So we're looking to build capability internally within our planning team on this agenda. We're looking to see whether we can find flexibility to better support through the planning system the retrofit of heritage assets, and I think we can provide further advice on that through the guidance that's coming through. But it's a real tricky one, and I think we have to look at the full range of levers that are available to us, including thinking a bit more innovatively about the products that are available and how they're used, thinking about the same sustainability of the buildings themselves into the future and their usage, and just collaborating and having further conversations on how we overcome some of these challenges. Thank you, Amy. And Sonal, a more technical question for you. Should owner-occupiers include Scope 3 in their net zero carbon plans, or are we just referring to net zero embodied and operational?
I mean, there is no end to ambition here. At the base minimum, do what is under your direct control. But we know, like we've heard from Councillor Heather Acton, what's under your direct control is often going to be minimal. Looking at council, it's 2%, and they are looking at their Scope 3. So depending on where you are on your net zero journey, if your business approach allows, absolutely, you can have so much more significant impact by accounting for your Scope 3 emissions, by influencing it in the right direction. And I mean, again, it is something which many of the progressive companies are doing it, including within Westminster. And in the context of built environment specifically, it's not like you're going to solve every problem in the world. Identify what is your material Scope 3. Which part of your supply chain you need to target. Is it your tenant emissions? Is it cement and steel that goes in your building? Just get started somewhere is a good place to be.
Thank you. I think that's great advice from Sonal. Amy, there's quite a few questions for the council from our audience. So I'm going to come back to you. And there's one on the role that the council can play in promoting building owners to go all electric and perhaps discouraging gas boilers and systems in future.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, we very much recognise that that's going to need to be part of the solution, I guess. We're trying to look at this from the perspective of the energy hierarchy. I'm not sure if you've come across that, which is about prioritising reduction in demand first through greater energy efficiency, through the way that buildings are designed. But then very much as a sort of secondary option is looking at how we source and heat and cool and provide electricity from, if it's not possible to do that through renewables, so zero carbon options, then through low carbon options, looking at the role of decentralized heating systems and how we can improve Westminster's record on providing renewables capability. I think we don't perform well on that compared to our other London boroughs, and it's something that we're seriously going to be looking at. So whilst I don't have a really clear plan or approach to tell you about today, it's definitely part of our key part of the action plan for the city that we're seeking to develop, and I'm happy to provide a bit more information on that, but that's a collaborative approach with businesses and with residents that we're looking to drive forward into next year.
Thank you very much, Amy. And Sonal, we've got another question on the white paper itself. In the white paper, we look to learnings from other cities, and there's a question, could we highlight some of the most relevant national or international case studies that we've looked at?
So we have a number of case studies which look at specific programs cities have launched to tackle existing building retrofit, to look at governance they have set up, to look at plans put in place and how use of offsetting fund is being redirected. What I'll say is all of those are really good examples. They are best practice international and national example, from Copenhagen to New York to what's happening within UK. I will say everyone is still early on in their journey though. So these are good examples to take on, actively engage on lessons learned. And there's no point recreating your own program of works, but it'll go through this whole approach at city level. We'll probably go through a few rounds of iterations, but I mean, in terms of leaving with some key themes that have come out of our researches, I think just setting up proper governance at city level to ensure the robust strategies put forward and the implementation is secured is quite powerful. Transparency and data is again coming out as a strong theme, both in the way we encourage public reporting, but also the way in which we redirect investment within the city is also quite useful. But lots to learn from, I would say. I mean, there's no one single example there's probably the New York City Accelerator Program, which is a bit more advanced. And maybe the Milton Keynes Offset Fund Program is a good one to reference.
I was actually just going to say that as well, Sonal. I completely agree with your remarks, but I really like the New York case study, which for those that don't know, it's a free sort of personalised advisory service to help people understand what energy efficiency improvements they can make to their building stock and their homes. And I think just on the lines of everything that we've been discussing this afternoon about sharing knowledge and helping others, I think that's a brilliant service, and they've managed to understand how much how that's improved the energy intensity of the stock through that service. So I thought that was quite a good example from one of our case studies.
Thank you, Tor and Sonal. And I think we've got time for one more question from me for the whole panel before we wrap up and close. And I'm going to come to Amy first, and then perhaps Sonal and Tor. So Amy, what's the one takeaway from the Zero Carbon Westminster white paper that you'd have for our audience?
I mean, I guess the main thing that comes out really strongly for me in terms of the white paper is the fact that it's such a strong demonstration of kind of joint accountability and ownership of this problem. And that's really, really welcome from our perspective. And I think the scale of the response required if we're really going to achieve carbon neutrality by 2040 is quite immense and sometimes quite overwhelming when you think about it. So we're really only ever going to make a huge dent on that target if we can work together. And in sort of providing this demonstration of partnership working between the WPA and Westminster City Council, I think it stands as a really great model that we can show others in terms of building a real citywide collaboration around this agenda and getting everybody to kind of pool experience, expertise, knowledge and influence to make a dent on the target and have an impact.
Thank you, Amy. And I think that's a really great foundation for us all to build on. Sonal.
It's hard to pull out one key takeaway, but I'll have a go. I think it's a takeaway and an ask, I would say, is you know, this powerful ambition from Westminster on net zero carbon, and having just heard Dr. Amy Jones and Councillor Heather Acton, I mean, we should all, as WPA members, we should all be rest assured that we don't need any further permission to go and act on our net zero carbon journeys. I mean, the value of carbon saved now is way more than carbon saved in 2039. So I think the takeaway is there are great recommendations. I think we need to now get started with some of the next steps fairly quickly.
Thank you. And Tor.
Thanks, Mike. I mean, I absolutely agree with what Amy and Sonal have said. I think for me, I think when you're reading this report, you know, at sort of first glance, a lot of it can seem quite intimidating. You know, it's difficult to know where to start because there's so much you can do. So I suppose my takeaway would be to, you know, for everyone to really understand, if you haven't already, your business or your personal footprint, and understand where you can make the biggest difference, and then target your efforts and funds into those activities. And I think the other thing is take some comfort that, you know, not all of these, you know, there are costs to some of these, you know, there will be costs to some measures and changes on the pathway to net zero, but not everything has to cost money. You know, reducing your own demand, reducing your tenants' energy demand, or switching to renewable electricity, that doesn't cost anything. So I think there are things that can have a significant impact without costing money, and that seems like a great place to start.
Thank you, Tor. And before I wrap up with a few closing thoughts of my own, I've got the results of our second poll, and as I've kind of sat here listening to the debate and the alignment between our panelists, I can see that there's been over 100 people in the audience listening to this debate, which I think shows the level of interest from right across the built environment sector in Westminster. And we asked you what the most impactful recommendations for WPA members were, and it was close. But in first place, you said a switch to renewable energy supply, followed by upfront investment for maintaining and retrofitting older buildings, and third, considering designs for new builds which are flexible, adaptable, and use fewer materials. And I think they're all things that we look at in more detail in the report. So just to conclude in the few minutes that we have left, with a few thoughts of my own from a British Land perspective, I know over the last few years, the way that we think about sustainability in British land has changed, and it's become business as usual. Making environmentally and socially intelligent decisions makes sound financial sense. And I think that's reflected by the things that our panel have said today and across the WPA membership. And I think we all recognise that the business case now for zero carbon, and it's about the how. And I think what this paper tries to do is provide a guide and some of the detail as to how the how, and our speakers have brought that to life brilliantly today. So again, I'm thinking about our own business. We have a solid track record to build on, but now we really need to accelerate progress to make our whole portfolio net zero, and indeed the whole city of Westminster net zero. And this white paper, I think, supports that agenda and provides a blueprint to collaborate across the city's property industry and with the council, with property owners and with advisors. And on that note, I think all there is left for me to do is to thank our speaker, Heather Acton, and our panelists, Dr. Amy Jones, Tor Burrows, Sonal Jain, and the executive team at the WPA for doing such a fantastic job in supporting us in preparing this report and in organising this webinar today. And I hope you've all enjoyed it, found it useful.